The drawings are kept in a cardboard box in the basement of Lawrence Elementary School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Yellowed construction paper. Crayon and pencil sketches created by second graders during art class on March 14, 1962. The assignment was simple. Draw your imaginary friend. Teacher Helen Morrison expected the usual chaos of childhood imagination. Fantastical creatures, cartoon characters, invisible pets. What she got instead made her hands shake as she collected the papers. 37 children, 37 drawings, and every single one depicted the same figure. A tall, thin man in a dark suit. No face, just a blank oval where features should be. Long arms that extended past the knees. And in every drawing, without exception, the figure was standing in the background, behind the child, watching. Morrison reported the incident to the principal, who contacted the school district psychologist. The drawings were collected, the children were interviewed separately, and the official report, filed 3 weeks later and sealed until 1999, concluded that the incident was unexplained but not indicative of coordinated deception or mass hysteria. The children insisted they hadn't discussed their drawings beforehand. They insisted they'd each drawn their own friend, their own companion who visited them at night, who stood in corners and watched them sleep, who whispered things they couldn't quite remember when they woke up. The school district's recommendation was to destroy the drawings and never speak of the incident again. Helen Morrison kept them instead, and when she died in 1998, her daughter found the box with a note attached in her mother's handwriting. They all drew him, they all knew his name, and I saw him too, standing at the back of the classroom while they worked, watching them draw his portrait. For 60 years, this incident has been filed away as a curious footnote in child psychology, an anomaly, one of those strange collective behaviors that occasionally emerges in groups of children and defies easy explanation. But it wasn't an isolated event. Recent research into historical archives has uncovered similar incidents spanning over a century. 1887, Boston, an orphanage where 14 children independently described the same tall, dark man who visited them in the dormitory. 1923, rural Montana, a one-room schoolhouse where students reported seeing a figure in formal dress standing in the windows after dark. 1945, post-war London, evacuee children in a countryside home who all claimed to have befriended someone they called the Thin Gentleman. 1978, suburban Philadelphia, a daycare where 18 children drew remarkably similar figures during free play, all featuring the same elongated proportions and featureless face. The pattern is consistent. The descriptions match. And in every documented case, adults dismissed it as imagination, as children influencing each other, as mass suggestion, until we started examining what happened to those children. Because the Cedar Rapids incident wasn't just about drawings, it was about what came after. What if childhood imaginary friends aren't always imaginary? What if the line between psychological phenomenon and external presence is more porous than we've assumed? What if 37 children in 1962 didn't create the same imaginary friend through some inexplicable coincidence of young minds, but rather documented something that was actually there? Something that has been there, appearing to children across generations, across continents, consistent in its appearance because it's not a product of imagination, but a genuine entity that children are uniquely positioned to perceive. The evidence that's emerged from unsealed school records, psychiatric evaluations, and decades of follow-up research suggests something far more disturbing than a quirky psychological curiosity. It suggests that certain children, under certain conditions, become aware of a presence that exists just outside the normal range of adult perception. A presence that appears as a friend, that offers companionship, but that extracts a price for that companionship that isn't fully understood until decades later. This is the story of those 37 children, what they saw, what they drew, and what happened to them in the years that followed. Because the drawings were just the beginning, the truth is far darker, and it's still unfolding. The concept of imaginary friends is well established in child psychology. Studies suggest that up to 65% of children create some form of imaginary companion before the age of 7. These companions serve important developmental functions. They provide comfort during stress, offer a safe outlet for emotions children don't yet have language for, and help kids practice social interaction. Most imaginary friends are benign, often based on familiar figures from the child's environment. Animals, cartoon characters, idealized versions of people they know. Most children outgrow them by age 8 or 9, incorporating the functions the imaginary friend served into their developing sense of self. This is normal. This is healthy. This is well understood. But there's a subset of imaginary friend reports that don't fit the standard psychological model. Reports where multiple children describe the same companion without having communicated about it. Where the descriptions are too specific, too consistent to be explained by coincidence or cultural influence. Where the companion appears not as a comforting presence, but as something that inspires unease even in the children who claim it as a friend. The archetype appears across cultures with disturbing consistency: tall, thin, well-dressed, faceless, or with features described as blurry or hard to remember, often associated with authority or formality. A suit, a hat, old-fashioned clothing that suggests an adult but not a parent. The figure typically appears in liminal spaces: doorways, corners, windows, the edge of a child's peripheral vision. It doesn't speak, or when it does, the words are forgotten immediately after being heard. Children who report this figure describe feeling watched, but not always threatened. They describe a sense that the figure wants something, but they can't articulate what. And crucially, they describe the figure as appearing across multiple locations, following them from home to school, appearing in places the child has never been before, suggesting a persistent presence rather than a location-bound haunting. Folklore provides uncomfortable parallels. The German Der Grossmann, or tall man, appears in regional legends dating back to the 16th century, described as a fairy tale villain who abducts children from forests. The figure wears black, has no face, and appears in woodcut illustrations that bear striking resemblance to children's drawings from the 20th and 21st centuries. Similar entities appear in Scandinavian folklore, Slavic traditions, and even indigenous American legends. Figures associated with forests or liminal spaces, often described as tall, thin, and unnaturally proportioned. These weren't considered imaginary friends in historical context. They were warnings, cautionary tales to keep children from wandering, but the descriptions are too specific to be purely inventive. They match the pattern too closely. As if the folklore wasn't creating the archetype, but rather documenting something that had been observed and needed to be explained. The Cedar Rapids incident of 1962 occurred during a specific historical moment. Post-war America, the height of the Cold War, children growing up under the shadow of nuclear threat, practicing duck-and-cover drills, absorbing adult anxiety about invisible dangers. Child psychology of the era was heavily influenced by Freudian theory, with emphasis on the subconscious, on the idea that children's minds were processing adult fears in symbolic form. When the school psychologist interviewed the children about their drawings, this was the framework he applied. The tall figure, he concluded, represented authority anxiety. The facelessness represented the impersonal nature of institutional power. The figure's presence in background suggested children feeling surveilled by adult society. His report recommended counseling for children showing signs of anxiety, reassurance for parents, and no further investigation. The drawings were considered symptoms of a shared cultural trauma, not evidence of a shared experience. But the children told a different story. 22 of the 37 agreed to detailed interviews in 1962. The interviews, conducted separately to prevent collaboration, revealed disturbing consistency. The children didn't call the figure by a name initially. They referred to it as the tall man, or the thin man, or the suit man. When asked how they knew about this figure, every child gave essentially the same answer. It appeared to them, usually at night, usually when they were alone. It would stand in their room, in corners where shadows gathered, and watch them. Some children reported that it appeared in their dreams, but insisted it was different from normal dream figures, more solid, more present, more real. When asked if they were scared, responses varied. Some said yes. Others said they'd been scared at first but had gotten used to it. Several said the figure felt lonely, that they felt sorry for it, that they'd started thinking of it as a friend because it seemed to want companionship. The psychologist noted in his report that the children's affect was concerning. They spoke about the figure matter-of-factly, with the casual acceptance that children bring to things adults would find disturbing. Several children mentioned that the figure had shown them things. Though when pressed for details, they became vague, saying they couldn't quite remember or that they'd been asked not to tell. One 7-year-old girl named Susan Michaels told the psychologist something that he included in his notes but didn't pursue. "He's always been here. He just needs people to see him. That's why he likes children. We see him better than grown-ups do. He says when we're older we'll forget him like everyone else does, but he'll still be here, waiting for more children." The psychologist diagnosed several children with anxiety disorders. He recommended that parents discourage discussion of the figure, redirect children's attention to concrete reality, and consider limiting exposure to television and frightening stories. Within 3 months, most children stopped mentioning the figure. When interviewed again at the end of the school year, many claimed not to remember drawing it. A few insisted they'd just been copying what other kids were doing, even though the interviews had established they'd created their drawings independently. The incident was considered resolved. The children had moved on. The psychological contagion, if that's what it was, had run its course. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed, because over the following decades, researchers began tracking what happened to those children, and the pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. In 1985, a graduate student named Margaret Chen at the University of Iowa was researching childhood psychological phenomena for her dissertation. She came across a brief mention of the Cedar Rapids incident in archived school district records. Intrigued, she tracked down the original report, found the list of children involved, and decided to conduct follow-up interviews. What she discovered would consume the next 15 years of her research. Of the 37 children, Chen successfully contacted 29, now adults in their 30s. Her findings, published in 1987 in the Journal of Anomalous Psychology, documented several disturbing patterns. First, an unusually high percentage reported recurring nightmares featuring a tall, faceless figure, not continuously, but episodically throughout their lives. Second, 12 of the 29 reported experiencing what they described as episodes of missing time during childhood and adolescence, periods where they couldn't account for hours, sometimes finding themselves in locations with no memory of traveling there. Third, and most disturbingly, 6 of the 29 had been diagnosed with schizophrenia or related disorders, a rate significantly higher than population averages. Chen's interpretation was cautious. She suggested that the 1962 incident might have been an early indicator of psychological vulnerability in these children, that the shared delusion was a symptom rather than a cause of later mental health issues. But buried in her research notes, which weren't published until after her death in 2003, were observations she couldn't incorporate into her academic work. Multiple subjects reported that the figure hadn't disappeared from their lives. It still appeared occasionally. In moments of stress or transition, it still watched. And several subjects reported that in adulthood, they'd begun to understand what it wanted. "It's hungry," one subject told Chen in an interview that she noted as too disturbing to include in formal analysis. Not for food, for attention, for acknowledgement. It exists because we see it. The more people who see it, the more real it becomes. That's why it appears to children. We haven't learned to not see yet. We haven't learned that some things aren't supposed to be there. The investigation deepened in the late 1990s when the internet allowed researchers to connect disparate cases. A message board dedicated to unusual childhood experiences became a repository for hundreds of reports of the tall man phenomenon. Adults sharing memories of childhood encounters with a figure matching the Cedar Rapids description. The reports came from across the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia. No geographic pattern, but temporal patterns emerged. Clusters of reports from specific years: 1962, 1978, 1983, 1996. As if whatever the figure was, it became more active during certain periods, or perhaps more accurately, more visible, more capable of manifesting in a way that children could perceive and remember. Researchers began compiling databases of reports, looking for commonalities beyond the physical description. Several patterns emerged. The figure appeared most commonly to children between ages 5 and 9. It appeared more frequently to children experiencing isolation, stress, or family trauma, though not exclusively. It appeared in both urban and rural settings, suggesting it wasn't tied to specific locations. And crucially, children who reported prolonged contact with the figure, seeing it repeatedly over months or years, showed higher rates of later psychological disturbance than children who reported single sightings. Dr. Michael Hartley, a psychiatrist specializing in childhood trauma, spent 5 years studying the phenomenon between 2001 and 2006. His research, partially funded by a private foundation and never fully published, included interviews with over 200 adults who reported childhood experiences with the faceless figure. Hartley's conclusion, shared in conference presentations, but never formally written up for peer review, was that the phenomenon represented a form of psychological infection. His theory proposed that certain children, under certain conditions, become susceptible to a shared hallucinatory experience transmitted through cultural exposure. The figure exists as a kind of mental virus, not a physical entity, but a pattern of neural activation that can be triggered and sustained by environmental factors. The internet age, Hartley argued, has made this transmission more efficient. Children exposed to images or descriptions of the figure online become primed to experience their own manifestations. It's not that the figure is real, but that the idea of the figure is real, and human brains, especially developing brains, are vulnerable to ideas that match certain archetypal patterns. Hartley's theory was compelling to many in the psychiatric community. It explained the consistency of descriptions through cultural transmission rather than supernatural presence. It explained the clustering of reports around specific time periods through social contagion. It explained the psychological sequelae through trauma imprinting. Children who experience persistent hallucinations of a threatening figure naturally develop anxiety, paranoia, and in severe cases, psychotic symptoms. The theory was neat, comprehensive, scientifically respectable. There was only one problem. It didn't explain cases that predated cultural exposure. It didn't explain how children in 1962, in an era before internet, before widespread media coverage of such phenomena, before the archetype had entered popular consciousness, could independently generate identical imagery. Unless the cultural transmission was older, much older. Unless the archetype was embedded so deeply in human consciousness that it didn't require explicit exposure. Unless it was something we carry in our genetic memory, activated under specific conditions of stress or developmental vulnerability. Or unless, and this is where scientific explanation breaks down, the figure is actually there. And what we're calling cultural transmission is simply different people documenting the same entity across time and space. The breakthrough came in 2011 with the discovery of the Ashland files. Dr. Richard Ashland was a child psychiatrist who practiced in rural Vermont from 1952 until his death in 1989. His private practice records, discovered during the sale of his estate, included documentation of over 300 child patients spanning nearly 4 decades. Ashland had maintained detailed case notes, far more extensive than typical psychiatric records, and running through dozens of his cases, across multiple years and family backgrounds, was reference to the tall gentleman, or variations of the name. Ashland hadn't dismissed these reports as imagination. He'd documented them methodically, looking for patterns, compiling what amounted to a secret research project that he never published or shared with colleagues. His notes reveal a man increasingly convinced that something beyond conventional psychology was occurring. "These children are not delusional," he wrote in a 1967 entry. "They are reporting a genuine perceptual experience. The question is not whether they see the figure, but what the figure is. My working hypothesis: there exists a class of entities that occupy the boundary between psychological and physical reality. They are sustained by attention, by belief, by the act of perception itself. Children see them because children haven't yet learned the consensus reality that excludes them. The figure these children describe feeds on the act of being seen. The more children who perceive it, the stronger its manifestation becomes. This is not psychology. This is something else. Ashland's notes describe his attempts to treat children reporting contact with the figure. Standard therapeutic approaches, cognitive behavioral therapy, reassurance, medication for anxiety, showed limited effectiveness. But he discovered something interesting. Children who were taught to actively reject the figure, to consciously deny its presence and refuse to engage with it, reported that the appearances decreased and eventually stopped. It wasn't enough to ignore it passively. Active rejection was required. Ashland developed a protocol. When a child reported seeing the figure, he would validate their experience, but teach them to verbally reject it. "I see you, but I don't accept you. You're not welcome here. You need to leave." Repeated application of this formula, Ashland claimed, reduced manifestations in 70% of cases. The children who couldn't or wouldn't perform the rejection continued to see the figure, and in Ashland's tracking, showed worse long-term outcomes. His final note, written weeks before his death, is haunting. "I believe I've attracted its attention through my work. It's appeared to me twice now, in my office after hours, standing in the corner, watching. I understand now why children are vulnerable. It's not that they see it because they're children. It's that children have something it needs. Potential, openness, years of belief ahead of them. It's farming them, cultivating witnesses, and I've been helping it by documenting everything, by taking it seriously, by giving it the attention it craves. I should have burned these notes years ago, but I need someone to know. I need someone to understand what we're dealing with. This isn't folklore. This is predation." The Ashland files sparked renewed investigation. Researchers began examining whether the figure was indeed a thought form, an entity that exists because it is believed in, that gains strength from collective attention, that manifests more strongly in places and times when many people are aware of it. This would explain the internet age surge in reports. Every creepypasta story, every viral image, every discussion thread about the tall man or slender man, or any of the names attached to this archetype, adds energy to the egregore, makes it more real, more capable of manifesting, more able to appear to children who've been primed by cultural exposure. But it doesn't explain the historical reports, unless the egregore is far older than we realized, unless it's been building for centuries, fed by folklore and legend and whispered warnings, growing stronger across generations, unless it's reached a critical mass where it no longer needs folklore to sustain it, where it's sufficiently real that children can perceive it directly without cultural priming, where it's become a permanent fixture of human reality, existing in the liminal spaces where consciousness and external world blur together. The dark heart of the 1962 incident isn't just that 37 children drew the same figure. It's what happened in the weeks before the drawings. Because when researchers finally conducted extensive interviews with surviving students in the 2000s, a fuller picture emerged. The drawings happened on March 14th, but the appearances had started in January. Multiple children reported seeing the figure at school during those months, in hallways, in windows, in the corner of the cafeteria. They'd mentioned it to each other. They'd compared notes. They'd realized they were all seeing the same thing. And they'd started to think of it as a kind of mascot, a shared secret, their special friend that adults couldn't see. The drawing assignment was meant to be fun, but it became documentation, proof that they were all experiencing the same phenomenon. When teacher Helen Morrison collected the papers and saw the identical figures, she felt something that made her physically ill, a recognition that she was looking at evidence of something impossible. And then, according to her private journals discovered after her death, she looked up, and the figure was there, standing at the back of the classroom, tall and thin and wearing that dark suit, faceless, watching the children draw its portrait. She stared at it for nearly a minute, frozen, while the children worked, and then it moved, not walking, just suddenly closer, suddenly near enough that she could smell something wrong, rot and dust and cold metal. She grabbed the drawings, told the children to clean up, and rushed them to the playground. When she returned to the classroom, it was gone, but she could still feel it watching. And she understood, with absolute certainty, that it was real, that the children hadn't imagined it, that something had been cultivating their attention, and that by documenting it, By having them draw it, she'd given it exactly what it wanted. Proof. Acknowledgement. 37 confirmations that it existed. 37 small minds convinced of its reality. 37 sources of belief to feed on. Morrison never spoke about this publicly. She couldn't. Who would believe her? But she kept the drawings because they were evidence. And she watched those children for the rest of the school year with growing horror, as several of them became withdrawn, reported nightmares, started showing signs of what school counselors called adjustment problems. 3 children were held back a grade. 5 changed schools the following year. 1 was institutionalized briefly for what her parents described as night terrors, so severe she stopped sleeping. Morrison blamed herself. She'd been the one to give the assignment. She'd been the one to validate the figure by collecting documentation of it. She'd made it more real, and she couldn't undo it. The figure had been seen, drawn, acknowledged. It had achieved a level of manifestation in those children's minds that wouldn't fade. By the time Morrison died in 1998, she'd spent 36 years carrying the guilt of what she'd inadvertently done. Her note with the drawings was part confession, part warning. This is real. Don't give it attention. Don't let more children see it. Don't feed it by investigating. But her warning was discovered too late. The investigation had already begun. And with every academic paper, every news article, every online discussion, the figure was receiving exactly what Morrison had feared. More attention, more belief, more reality. The children from Cedar Rapids, now in their 60s and 70s, present a disturbing longitudinal study. Of the 37, researchers have confirmed the outcomes for 33. 4 are deceased, 2 from suicide, 2 from accidents that family members describe as strange without elaborating. Of the surviving 29, 8 have spent time in psychiatric facilities. 14 report ongoing experiences with the figure, not constant but periodic reappearances throughout their lives. 5 have refused all contact with researchers, citing privacy concerns but also expressing, in the few communications they've had, a fear that talking about the figure makes it stronger. And 2 have become advocates for recognition of the phenomenon, arguing that the figure is real, that it poses genuine danger to children, and that suppressing information about it only makes children more vulnerable. One of these advocates, Robert Chen, was 7 years old in 1962. Now 70, he spent the last 20 years trying to document and understand what he experienced. His testimony is compelling and disturbing. It never left me. I thought it had for years. I didn't see it through my teens or 20s, but it was always there, just out of sight. And as I got older, I started to understand what it was doing. It was waiting to see if I'd have children, because that's how it perpetuates. It appears to one generation, establishes itself in their minds, waits for them to have kids, and then it has access to a whole new group. I saw it again when my daughter was born, standing in the corner of the hospital room, and I knew it wasn't there for me. It was there for her. I tried everything to protect her, kept lights on, never left her alone. Taught her from the time she could talk that if she saw a tall man in dark clothes, she should reject him. But when she was 6, she drew a picture in school. The teacher called me, concerned. The picture was of a tall figure in a suit with no face, standing behind our family. My daughter told me he'd been visiting her for months, that he was nice, that he told her secrets. I'd failed. Despite everything, it had gotten to her. And through her, it's reaching her generation. This isn't a psychological phenomenon. This is an entity that's learned to use human consciousness as a habitat. It lives in the space between imagination and perception, and it's spreading. The revelation that emerges from decades of investigation is both simple and terrifying. The figure exists because we believe in it. But belief in this case isn't a matter of conscious choice. Belief is the act of perception. When a child sees the figure, when they draw it, when they describe it to others, they're not creating it through imagination. They're documenting something that has achieved sufficient reality through accumulated belief across generations that it can now manifest independent of cultural transmission. The figure has bootstrapped itself into existence. What may have started as folklore, as cautionary tales, as misidentified experiences, has been given so much attention, so much fear, so much belief across centuries that it's become genuinely real in the way that matters. It can affect physical reality. It can appear. It can be seen. It can influence developing minds. And it's most visible to children not because children are more imaginative, but because children haven't yet developed the cognitive filters that adults use to screen out perceptual anomalies. Adults see it too occasionally, but dismiss it immediately as imagination or misperception. Children don't have that dismissal reflex yet. They see it, accept it, and in accepting it, give it more reality, more power, more ability to manifest to the next child. This is the truth that researchers have been circling around for decades without being able to state directly. We are dealing with a predatory entity that has evolved to exploit human consciousness. It requires attention to exist. It has developed an appearance and behavior pattern optimized to attract and hold that attention, especially from vulnerable populations like children. It doesn't physically harm, not directly, but its presence causes psychological trauma that manifests as anxiety, nightmares, dissociation, and, in extreme cases, full psychotic breaks. It may not be conscious in the way we understand consciousness. It may simply be a pattern that perpetuates itself, like a virus, using human minds as replication machinery. But the effect is the same. Children see it, are affected by it, carry it with them, and pass it to the next generation. And with each generation, with each retelling, with each new batch of drawings and reports and investigations, it grows stronger. The internet has accelerated this process exponentially. What once spread through whispered stories and rare documented cases now spreads globally, instantaneously. Children encounter images and descriptions of the figure online, often packaged as fiction, as creepypasta, as entertainment. But exposure creates vulnerability. The mind, once primed with the archetype, begins to see it, begins to make it real. And the figure, fed by millions of impressions, by countless acts of attention and fear and fascination, achieves levels of manifestation that previous generations never witnessed. It's stronger now than it's ever been, more real, more capable of affecting physical reality, and it's still growing. The question facing researchers, parents, and mental health professionals is impossible. How do you protect children from something that becomes more real the more you warn them about it? The traditional approach, education, awareness, teaching children to recognize danger, actively makes this situation worse. Every parent who tells their child about the figure, every teacher who discusses it, every therapist who validates a child's experience is feeding it, giving it more belief, more reality, more power. But silence is equally dangerous. Children encounter the figure anyway, through cultural osmosis, through direct perception, through whatever mechanism allows it to manifest. Without understanding what they're experiencing, they're more vulnerable, more likely to engage with it, to befriend it, to give it sustained attention. The only approach that seems effective, based on Dr. Ashland's work and subsequent research, is immediate active rejection. The moment a child reports seeing the figure, parents must validate the perception. I believe you saw something, but teach rejection. But it's not welcome and you have the power to make it leave. No discussion of what it is, no speculation about its nature, just validation and rejection. This approach requires walking an impossible line, acknowledging the figure's reality enough to empower the child to resist it, while not giving it enough attention to strengthen it. Most parents can't maintain that balance. Most default to either dismissal, which leaves the child vulnerable, or investigation, which feeds the entity. The Cedar Rapids children are now elderly. Most prefer not to discuss what happened. The ones who do speak paint a picture of lives haunted by something they can't fully explain, something that has shaped their psychology, their relationships, their sense of reality. They describe living with the knowledge that their childhood friend wasn't a friend, that it took something from them, not dramatically, not through obvious harm, but through persistent presence, through the gradual erosion of the boundary between what's real and what's imagined. Several describe feeling watched their entire lives, feeling that something has been tracking them, waiting for moments of vulnerability, appearing briefly in peripheries during times of stress. One woman, who requested anonymity, described her experience. "I'm 71 years old. I have grandchildren. I've lived a full life. But I've never felt alone. It's always there, just out of sight. And the worst part is knowing that it's not just me. That there are thousands of us, maybe tens of thousands, carrying this thing in our minds. And every time one of us tells our story, every time someone investigates or writes about it or discusses it, we're making it stronger. We're feeding it. That's what it wants. That's all it wants. To be seen, to be believed, to be real. And we can't stop ourselves from giving it what it wants because the need to understand, the need to warn others, the need to not be alone in this, that need is stronger than our fear of making it worse. The question that haunts this investigation is whether the figure was always there, existing in some liminal space between reality and imagination, simply waiting to be perceived, or whether we created it through the act of imagination itself, through centuries of folklore and fear and storytelling, until we'd invested enough belief that it achieved genuine existence. The answer might not matter. The result is the same. Something exists now that uses human consciousness as its habitat. Something that manifests most strongly to children. Something that is learned across generations to optimize its appearance and behavior for maximum impact. The blank face, universal trigger for uncanny valley responses. The dark suit, symbol of authority and formality, unthreatening but imposing. The excessive height and thin proportions, unsettling without being obviously monstrous. The behavior of watching without approaching, creating unease without triggering immediate flight. Every element of the figure is perfectly designed to hold attention while inspiring discomfort. To be remembered, to be discussed, to be drawn, to be passed on. What happened in Cedar Rapids in 1962 wasn't unique. It was simply well documented. It happened because 37 children in the same place at the same time were perceiving the same entity. And a teacher, perhaps more sensitive or more observant than most, saw it too. The drawings were meant to be innocent, but they became evidence. They became proof, locked in a box, waiting decades to be discovered and studied and analyzed. And every person who studied them, every researcher who's examined the yellowed papers and seen the identical figures, has added their attention to the entity's power. The investigation meant to understand the phenomenon has strengthened it. The documentation meant to warn future generations has primed future children to perceive it. We're caught in a loop. The more we try to understand and prevent, the more we feed what we're trying to understand and prevent. And there's no clear way out. No way to unbelieve something once belief has been established. No way to forget something that's been documented. No way to make something unreal once it's achieved reality through accumulated attention. The parents of the Cedar Rapids children, most now deceased, never fully understood what their children experienced. They accepted the school's explanation: mass hysteria, overactive imaginations, children influencing each other. They told their kids to forget about the tall man, to focus on real things, to stop making up stories. And the children, desperate to please their parents, desperate to be normal, stopped talking about it. But they didn't stop seeing it. They just learned to stay silent. They learned that some experiences can't be shared, that some realities are private, that some things are real even when everyone tells you they're not. And they grew up carrying that knowledge, that isolation, that burden of seeing something others dismiss. That experience shaped them, made them question their own perceptions, made them uncertain about the boundary between internal and external reality, made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of psychological disturbance that researchers later documented. The figure didn't destroy them directly. It destroyed them by making them unable to trust their own minds. By existing in that uncertain space where they could never be sure, was it real or did I imagine it? And that uncertainty, maintained across decades, is its own form of torture. The final revelation isn't about the figure itself, it's about what the figure represents. We like to think that reality is fixed, that there's a clear boundary between what exists and what doesn't, that imagination is separate from perception. But the figure demonstrates that this boundary is more porous than we believed. That consciousness, especially collective consciousness, especially accumulated belief across generations, can affect what manifests in reality, that we live in a world where thought forms can achieve sufficient solidity to be perceived, documented, and passed on. The figure is one example. But if it's real, if belief can create reality in this way, then what else have we made real through accumulated faith and fear? What other entities exist in the spaces between imagination and perception, sustained by attention, feeding on belief, growing stronger with each generation that documents them? The box of drawings sits in storage now, part of a university archive. Researchers occasionally request access. Each time they do, each time someone examines those 37 identical portraits of a tall, thin, faceless man in a dark suit, they're adding their attention to the accumulated total. They're making it more real. And somewhere, a child is seeing something in the corner of their room. Something tall and dark and wrong. Something that wants to be seen, that needs to be seen, that exists because it's seen. And that child will draw it, will show others, will document it, will pass it on. The cycle continues, the figure grows stronger, and we, in our desperate need to understand, keep feeding it exactly what it needs: attention, investigation, belief. The question isn't whether the 37 children in Cedar Rapids really saw the same imaginary friend. The question is whether calling it imaginary changes anything, whether the label we apply to something determines its reality, or whether reality is stranger than our labels allow, whether something can be both imaginary and real, both psychological and external, both created by our minds and independent of them. The figure doesn't care what we call it. It only cares that we see it, that we draw it, that we remember it, that we tell its story. And by reading this, by considering this investigation, by trying to understand what happened in that classroom 60 years ago, you've given it exactly what it wants: your attention, your belief, your acknowledgement that something impossible might actually be real. Helen Morrison's final note ends with a warning that researchers initially dismissed as the paranoia of an aging woman haunted by an event she couldn't explain. But now, decades later, with the benefit of extensive investigation and documentation, that warning reads differently. She wrote, "I wish I had never given them that assignment. I wish I had thrown away the drawings the moment I realized what they showed. Because now it knows. It knows that we know. And knowing makes it stronger." If you're reading this, if you found these drawings, if you're investigating what happened in my classroom, stop. Burn this box. Forget what you've learned. Don't tell anyone. Because every person who knows is another person who believes, another person who gives it power, another person who might see it. And if enough people see it, if enough people believe in it, it won't need children anymore. It'll be strong enough to appear to anyone, to everyone. We'll have made it fully real. Please, stop investigating, stop documenting, stop feeding it. But we haven't stopped. We can't stop. The need to understand is too strong. The evidence is too compelling. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. And so the figure grows stronger, appears more frequently, manifests more clearly, moves closer to full reality with each investigation, each documentary, each discussion. The 37 children from Cedar Rapids didn't create it. They simply documented what was already there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be believed, waiting for enough attention to achieve the critical mass where imagination becomes reality, where the thing we feared in the dark stops being metaphor and becomes presence. They were witnesses to something emerging, something that's still emerging, something that needs our belief to complete its transition from possibility to certainty, from maybe to definitely, from imaginary to real. Tonight, somewhere, a child is lying awake. They can feel something watching from the corner of their room, something tall and thin and wrong, and they're trying to decide, is it real, or is it just their imagination? The answer, terrifying as it is, might be both. Might be that the question itself is the wrong question, that reality isn't binary, that some things exist in the space between definitely and maybe, sustained by uncertainty, fed by attention, waiting patiently for enough people to see them that they can't be unseen. The 37 children drew the same friend because the friend was there, is there, will always be there, in corners and shadows and the edges of perception, watching children with its blank face, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be drawn, waiting to be remembered, waiting for us to make it completely, undeniably, inescapably real. And we're almost there, almost finished giving it what it needs, almost done turning myth into truth. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is whether we can stop believing in it before it's too late, before the thing that lives in children's drawings steps fully into our world and refuses to leave, before imaginary becomes permanent, before the friend becomes something we can't escape, can't deny, can't unsee, before the tall man in the dark suit, featureless and patient, stops being a story we tell and becomes a presence we live with, a shadow that follows us all, a friend we never wanted but can no longer reject. Because we've seen it now. We've acknowledged it. We've given it exactly what 37 children gave it in 1962. Proof that it's real.